That's not Grandma. I was always a difficult little girl, or so my mom tells me. Between the ages of 3 to 5, I had a tendency to wander off a lot, particularly at the supermarket. My mother watched me carefully, but every now and then she would turn her head for a moment and I would disappear, much to her hysteria. Usually she would find me a minute later, stuffing my face with chocolate from the shelf, the manager looking on with disapproval. One day, she decided to let me wander off, and to see how long it would take me to feel worried when I realized that she was not following. She kept her distance, peering through shelves at me as I tottered on, oblivious. Eventually, an old lady approached me and asked where my mother was. Mom waited for me to turn uncertainly, realized that I was lost, but then, in a swift motion, the old woman scooped me up in her arms, and my mother's heart sank. She hurried out of her hiding place to approach the woman, calling out, "Excuse me." The woman turned, and with horror, my mom realized it was actually a man dressed as an old lady. He began running to the door, and my mom raced after him, howling like a banshee. This must have freaked him out because he dropped me and fled the store. Needless to say, my mom never played games like that again, and I stopped wandering off. Supermarket Perv. I was 10 years old at the time, and it was a beautiful sunny day. Mom decided she needed some groceries, so off we went to the supermarket. When we got there, we parked facing a very busy road that had stoplights about 50 meters away from where we had parked on my right side. Mom only needed a few things, so I decided to wait in the car. As I was sitting there, I could see from the left side a man swaying up the footpath. He had a beer gut that you could see and looked like he hadn't showered for who knows how long. Normally, seeing people like this didn't bother me, especially considering it was the middle of the day and being beside the road with stoplights meant there were people around. However, I had this strong feeling that something was wrong. My mom owned a van, so he would have to be able to see me quite clearly from 20 meters away. As he was getting closer, my stomach dropped and I knew that something bad was going to happen. Intuition was on my side. When he was only a few meters away, I was whispering under my breath, keep walking, please." I knew he was staring right at me. He stopped directly in front of me, where I was sitting in the van, and started undoing his pants. I looked down and glanced to my left side to see if the door was locked. It wasn't. I wish I could say I locked it, but I was really too afraid at this point. I knew my mom's side would be unlocked too. After what felt like a lifetime, I looked up to see my first penis. This excuse of a human had just taken a wank in front of me. He then zipped his pants back up and went on his merry way. I jumped out of the van with tears streaming down my face on a mission to find my mom. After finally finding her, walking through the car park, while avoiding glances from the concerned public, I explained what had happened. I wasn't making much sense, but as soon as she understood what I was saying, she chucked the groceries in the van and told me to quickly get in. She started the van up, and we sped our way out of there. We patrolled the streets for a while, trying to find him, but no luck. One thing that surprised me was when we were driving around, my mom said I would have taken the knife from the glove box and chopped his balls off. I didn't even know we had a knife in the glove box. I remember being 13 and in high school telling my friends this story, and they all found it quite amusing. Honestly, I'm not even pissed. We all have a pretty warped sense of humor, but it sucks how so many girls have a creep's dick be the first dick they've ever seen. It's bloody terrifying. And also, I can't believe anyone driving by didn't care enough to stop and hit this perv up. Creepy supermarket wanker. Let's never meet again. The supermarket guy. Here's my story. I'm currently almost 18, and this happened when I was a 3 or 4-year-old boy. I know that because it's one of the first memories I can recall having myself, probably because it was a pretty major event in my otherwise simple life. I was living in Moscow with my parents and my older sister. We were a pretty poor family and lived a very conservative lifestyle. My parents would go to work every day, and while my sister was at school, my grandparents would come over and cook for me and look after me, which is very normal for a Russian family. Back to the point. It was summer of 2001 or 2002, and my family went out on our bi-weekly supermarket trip. It was a big deal, as I wasn't allowed to go out much due to the fact that we were living in a pretty rough district of Moscow. My dad was driving that day, and everything was normal when we got to the supermarket. While my mom and sister were getting all the food and other things, I would normally be with them. That day, I stopped to try and read a label or something, and when I looked back up, I realized that my mother wasn't there. She assumed that I was still following them, while I assumed that they were taking a while picking the groceries. My dad wasn't nearby, as I'll explain later. It was one of those moments which we all experience when we lose our parents in the supermarket and start freaking out. As a toddler, I obviously started tearing up and didn't really know what to do. Then, a man saw me, ran up to me and asked what was wrong. I told him that I lost my family, and he quickly asked if my mother was the blonde lady. I told him that she was, and he stretched out his hand and told me that he knew where they went. I immediately got very happy and held his hand as we walked out of the supermarket into the car park. Despite what my parents had told me about following strangers, I assumed that my mom had already bought everything and headed off back to the car. The man walked me to his car, opened the door, and told me to climb in. Looking back at it, that was probably the stupidest thing I ever did in my life, because I proceeded to get in the car as he shut the door. This is where my dad came into the story. When we were in the supermarket, he realized that he left a multimedia controller in the car. For those of you that this makes little sense to, this is what that means. As was common in Russia, not sure about other countries, cars at the time had the big multimedia boxes installed, and you could attach different controllers onto them, which were upgradable and gave you different functions or looked better, etc. These removable controllers were quite expensive, and thus it was extremely common for cars to be broken into in order to have them stolen. Thus, most people developed a habit of removing it and taking it with them, or at least putting it in the glove box. My dad quickly went to grab it from the car, fearing that it could be thieved. While he was in the car, he saw me walking with a stranger and immediately realized what was going on. He got out and sprinted towards us, and he got there just as the strange man closed the door with me in the car. I'm not going to pretend that I don't know what happened next, or make up a Hollywood-style fistfight between my dad and the man, but all I know is that a few seconds later, my dad carried me away from the car, and I couldn't see the man anywhere in sight. It was my dad's pounding heart that made me realize what had just happened, and I started crying hysterically and apologized to my dad and mom, who had ran outside to look for me. I think that was the last straw for my parents, as a month or so after, we sold our flat and lived with my grandparents, while my parents were finishing buying a new flat on the opposite side of the city in a much safer district. Parents, regardless of how smart you think your kids are, don't leave them unattended in public places. There are some horrible people around, and not only in Moscow. And to the strange man from all those years ago, let's never, ever meet again.